Welcome to the first episode of. We don't quite have a name for our podcast yet, but we will soon. I'm your host, Mike. I've been playing D&D since 3rd edition first came out in 2000. I've almost exclusively played 3rd edition, and also almost exclusively been the DM the entire time. And with me today are Flap, PhantasyPen, and Troacctid. So here's an introduction for Flap.
Hello, I'm Flap. I've been playing 3.5 since early 2016. I'm an optimizer by hobby and rules lawyer, exclusive to 3.5 just like Mike. I specialize with casters and have my own handbook as well.
And Fantasy.
Hello, I am PhantasyPen. I started playing when I was 16. I grabbed three of my friends, threw them into a Zombie Slayer one-shot, and I've been in love with the hobby ever since. I've played at least one session in every edition since 3.5, even that which must not be named. I am relatively quiet on the forums. My only big project, and the one you've probably heard of me from, is For Massive Damage, the Critical Hit Handbook. I specialize in martial characters, to be specific, melee characters.
And Troacctid.
Hi, I'm Jasmine Lawrence, also known as Troacctid. I am your resident Warlock aficionado. You might know me from my Warlockopedia, which is over 115,000 words of Warlock content. I'm also a terrific singer, very queer, and I like DMing better than playing.
And with introductions out of the way, today we're going to be talking about prestige classes, specifically the ones within the DMG, the original 16. So for anyone who isn't familiar with 3rd edition, prestige classes define your character in an even more specific way than the base classes because there are so many of them. They allow very specific character creation and customization, and they just do it so differently. Some refine your focus, and others provide extra actions for you to take. They can take what the base class does and make it better, and then there are some that just don't work the way they were supposed to, the way they were intended to. It just makes them fall apart. And unfortunately, when that happens, it's not a good thing. But fortunately, none of the ones in the DMG fall apart to that extent. We probably won't get through all of them right now, but we're going to get through some of them. So,
Yeah, so I was the one who picked this, who suggested this topic. And the reason I want to talk about prestige classes for our first episode is because they're one of the few mechanics that is truly unique to D&D 3.5. They've had other similar mechanics, and like 4th edition had their Paragon paths. Pathfinder technically has prestige classes, but they really de-emphasize them. But in 3.5, it's just such a huge part of character optimization that you don't see in any other edition. So I figured, hey, we're doing a 3.5 podcast. This is about as 3.5 as it gets.
that's true, and one thing that's amusing that not everyone's aware of is that prestige classes are actually an optional rule. They're considered a variant, and the DM has to allow them, but like 99.99% of the tables allow it, so
I'll be
For
honest,
those
I found that
for,
out like today.
yeah.
for those of you who play 5th edition, the same actually applies to multiclassing and feats. It's technically a variant, but if you don't allow it, you are likely to have very angry players.
Yes.
I'm just curious. Actually, have any of you guys ever come across a DM who does not allow prestige classes, or who doesn't allow the prestige class from the book, only the ones they made themselves?
I have actually seen a posting on Roll20 that did not allow prestige classes, and it blew my mind.
I have played with a DM who was like that. They were from my very original playgroup that did my zombie one shot.
I have never come upon a group like that, to be entirely honest, and I would never join a group like that.
I could understand it if it happened at the start of 3.0 when the system was new, but for it to have been in like any point after maybe the first couple years, I can't understand it. They just allow so much. I mean, there are in most books, most Splat books that came out, there are prestige classes. Even if it's only one or two, there are almost always prestige classes added in the books because it's such an integral part of the character creation. To make a book without prestige classes is to detract from the quality of that book, and it just means that people aren't as likely to purchase it because if it's not going to add to the playability. If you have a book all about the planes, for example, with the Planner Handbook, say that's great and it's interesting, but they had already come out with the manual of the planes. So if they didn't have character creation aspects in the Planner Handbook, there'd be little reason to get that book if you're not the DM. And that's a big thing. Like, there are obviously far more characters, more players, than there are DMs. So I think that's a factor in how prolific the prestige classes have become.
Well, I think we should talk about actually what is a prestige class, because hey, maybe some people are listening to our podcast who aren't that familiar with all the 3.5 rules. So, what is a prestige class exactly?
Well, a prestige class is basically an expansion of base classes. You must meet prerequisites and you get special abilities in return.
Yeah, that's definitely one way to look at it. It's a class that you have to meet the prerequisites for, so you can't just take it. With the base class, you can just always just go ahead and take a base class, with very few exceptions, like the paladin. You have to be lawful good, but for the most part, you can always just take a base class. Whereas with prestige classes, you can't just take it. You can never take a prestige class at level 1, because you will not have met whatever the prerequisites are.
Right, and that's kind of the core of them, is that you can only take them at higher levels. You can't start out as, an assassin or an eldritch knight. You have to earn it.
That's true, but there are a
The
couple exceptions.
core concept of a prestige class is that they are more powerful than a base class. Hence, they are prestige.
Yes,
Oh yeah,
that
they're often associated with specific organizations or things like that within the world.
Unfortunately, it's not always true, and sometimes they're even worse than the base class.
yes, I was trying to touch on that before, but I'm sure we'll have plenty of examples of that later on.
I'd actually even suggest there are a couple in the DMG.
Maybe one, but we'll get there.
Yeah, so like you talked about how there's sort of this feeling among a lot of players that every book needs to have new prestige classes in it. And I feel like Wizards of the Coast really ran with that idea, put a ton of prestige classes everywhere, but then you get Sturgeon's Law, which is 90% of everything is crap. And that definitely applies to the prestige classes as well. There's lots of them, and all of them are very good.
And then on top of that, Wizards of the Coast does not really have very good writing, and it all goes into a hot pile of mess. Only with
I
the
wouldn't
occasional gold bar in between.
I wouldn't say it's the writing. I would say most of the time it's more of the editing, because sometimes they have excellent ideas, excellent fluff, and then you look at the mechanics, the crunch of it, and it falls apart.
Well, I put that playtesting rather than editing.
They even
Okay,
have
I
playtesting
think of
though.
them as the same, but yes, I can agree with that statement.
I'm not completely sure, but I've heard that it wasn't even playtested with prestige classes.
It can feel that way. It can feel that way.
I once read somewhere that Wizards of the Coast never playtests anything beyond 10th level, which can definitely be seen in a lot of things.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
I mean, I might believe that, at least for the core rules. When if you get to the epic level handbook, then it's like, you kind of have to, right?
I believe they actually did not even playtest.
Yeah, look at some of the stuff in there, and then come back to me on that.
Fair enough.
It's the same with the deities and demigods.
That's very true.
I mean, I feel like with deities and demigods, it's a little different just because I think that they're supposed to be absurdly powerful because they're supposed to be deities. It's supposed to be outside the realm of what player characters can do. But I definitely see what you're saying.
I actually believe that intention of that comment was to say the opposite. It's too weak for what a deity is. Like a deity should not even have stats to begin with.
I
So
think we're
two
getting a little
things
off
there.
topic, though.
Yeah, two quick things there. One, uh, that shows how you view everything and how your power level differs from, say, my power level. But also, it comes out as the should this have stats at all? And
That's very true.
probably the deities should not have stats, but oh well.
We'll have to do another podcast on deities and
Yes,
demigods.
yes, that will
I
be
think
another
there's some
podcast.
stuff to unpack
Oh.
there.
Yeah.
I mean,
They
I
even have
think,
some prestige classes.
I think we are going to cover every book eventually. But
Ideally.
for
Back
now, let us go back to prestige classes. Specifically, we're looking at the ones in the DMG.
Shall we
Yeah,
just go
and-
through them in alphabetical order?
That
That-
works
That
for
seems
me.
appropriate.
All
So
right.
the prestige classes in the Dungeon Master's Guide are kind of emblematic of a lot of the prestige classes that you'll find in other sources. You know, it's like this is kind of what they started with, and it became the model for future ones.
And keeping that in mind, it's very interesting to think about what they chose to include also, because it's very true. You can
Yeah,
see
that's
it
a
later
great-
on how they built off of it.
Yeah,
Oh,
for
sure.
example, one could bring up the Adventure Prestige class, which is literally just the Assassin Prestige class, but copy pasted and lawful instead of evil.
To be fair, that was an April Fool's Day release.
The Arcane Archer is basically, you've seen it in, I think, I don't know if it showed up in 4th edition, but I do know it showed up in 5th edition as a fighter subclass.
The 5th edition Arcane Archer is significantly different from the prestige class to the point that the two are not really comparable.
Oh, I think you could certainly compare them. Basically, the idea is that you combine magic and archery. What that means in this case is that you have to have some amount of magical power. You need 3rd level arcane spells in order to meet
First
the requisites for the
level
class.
arcane spells,
First level.
actually.
First level arcane spells. Sorry, I'm thinking of Eldritch Knight now.
Yes, I was going to say most later prestige classes of what is commonly called the Gish category require 3rd level spells for their spellcasting component.
For clarification, a Gish is something that combines martial and magic into one.
Ooh, we should
Yes.
do an episode about gishes too.
Very good idea, but not something to focus on tonight.
Yeah. So basically, the Arcane Archer goes back to this idea of elves as sort of combination fighters and magic users, which goes all the way back to basic D&D, way back in the day, where elves could only be fighters or magic users.
And arguably to
Arcane-
the source of, fantasy writings prior to First Edition that inspired it.
I'd actually like to add that you can be a half elf to qualify for Arcane Archer.
The key part is that you need elf blood.
Yes, so this one
Which-
actually is a racial tradition of the elves.
Of course, if your world doesn't have elves, this can put the prestige class in a bit of a weird spot.
Which I will just briefly mention as many people have a lot of house rules where they kind of just tweak the rules a lot. Like for me, for example, I blatantly disregard any racial prerequisites because I think that, as you just said, it just wipes things out if you don't have it in your campaign.
That's very true. So should we start talking about mechanics, or should we continue about the theme of the class?
I think the theme is important in this case. Sometimes the theme and the mechanics don't always mesh, but I think this time it is important just because, as we're saying, mixing the archery and the magic, it's important to keep that in mind because when it comes to the mechanics, it no longer advances the spellcasting, despite the fact that you're supposed to be enhancing your archery with magic.
There is a way to fix that.
Using the class.
This is something we'll be covering in a later episode, I'm hoping. The Abjurant Champion prestige class from Complete Mage causes your caster level to be scaled off of your base attack bonus. The Arcane Archer gets a full progression base attack bonus,
Well, yeah, but that's
which
just your
is
caster level.
effectively the same as giving you a caster level increase at each level.
That doesn't actually give you higher level spells. It
That
gives
is
you
that
spells
is
more
why
power.
it is only a sort of advancement.
Actually, does
Well,
not give
listen.
you spell slots either. If you're like
Yeah,
dipping wizard, you have like the spell slots of a first level wizard.
so I think the idea of the Arcane Archer um, is that it's supposed to be more fighter and just a little bit of wizard, but there's one important class feature which kind of undermines that, and that feature is the imbue arrow. And this is kind of like the big selling point of the class. Basically, uh, you get to shoot an arrow, and that arrow carries a spell, and wherever the arrow lands, that's where the spell goes off. It's really cool. Like the idea is, oh, I'm gonna fire a fireball, but I'm gonna fire it out of an arrow, so I'll shoot you with an arrow, and then it explodes.
Reference, this can only be used for area effect spells, so any spells that do not have the prerequisite cannot be used.
And that's why you would basically want to take 2 levels of the Arcane Archer to reach your, mental image of the Arcane Archer, and then just go back to whatever casting class you had so that you can keep getting new and higher level spells to fire off of your arrows, because all of the later abilities, while potentially interesting, don't really have anything to do with your magical ability.
That does
Yeah,
not
but
mean, however, that the Arcane Archer's other abilities aren't useful.
It's true. It's just that
Yes,
fluff
the
side of it, that magic using Archer, it really stops at level 2. That image.
so there's sort of this dissonance in the class where
Yes.
it doesn't advance your casting, so you want to be okay. I'm mainly an archer, but then at the same time you have this ability that wants you to have big, powerful spells so that you can put them on your arrows. So it's like, okay, I want to be a caster. So the trick with an arcane archer is balancing those two things. Personally, I'm of the opinion that you shouldn't have to, walk that tightrope. I think, hey, why not give both? It's fun, but
Unfortunately, the Arcane Archer was one of the first prestige classes, so at the time they thought there was a tight rope that had to be walked.
yeah.
And it is
Actually, I would
evident.
like to,
Mm-hmm.
No,
I
we've
would
got
like to add that. So
our next
continue.
one. Are we? Should we move on to the next one?
I think we
There's
can.
something I want to mention. There's something I want to mention first. One thing that the Arcane Archer that has is really good in my opinion would be that enhanced arrow. Any arrow that you shoot, like it becomes of a higher enhancement level. At 9th level, it becomes a +5. So if you have even a
I think
act as such.
I think rather than moving on, it would be best to actually discuss the class's mechanics.
I agree, and I think it's very interesting that you brought up Enhanced Arrow, actually, because that's a carryover from the 3.0 version, when it mattered way, way more to have a higher enhancement bonus. So,
Oh, yeah.
super briefly, in 3.0, the damage reduction would have +1 and +2 and +3 requirements to bypass the damage reduction. So if
Yeah,
you didn't
have
have a
like a
high
monster.
enough enhancement, then you wouldn't be doing as much damage. But in
Right. So you have like this
3.5,
monster
it's
that's
just
like a
slash
+3
magic.
weapon.
Yeah, also correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in 3.0 this stacked, like the arrow enhancement and the bow enhancement. I mean,
Yes, yes, it did. So it's definitely a carryover. It's not useless. It's still gonna make you do more damage and hit easier, but it's just not nearly as much of an incentive to take the class just to get a +1 to your attack and damage every other level. Very underwhelming.
Okay, that was Enhance Arrow, and we've covered Imbue Arrow.
Next
Yeah,
up,
next
Seeker
one.
Arrow.
All
Well,
right.
I think we should
basically,
condense.
Secret Arrow, Phase Arrow, Hail of Arrows, and Arrow of Death are all sort of plays on the same theme of you got these super cool magic arrows, and you can use each of them once a day.
Yeah, it's
Yes.
either get bypass concealment, bypass something in your way to hit them, or hit lots of people.
A very important thing to note about Phase Arrow. It negates armor bonuses to your AC. So if you are facing a heavily armored plate mail wearing juggernaut, well, suddenly his only defense is his dexterity score. And that can be the difference between a hit or a miss in many occasions.
My
Don't
favorite
confuse
addition is
this
the
with
secret arrow.
touch armor class because this is actually different. This only ignores armor bonus instead of natural armor and shield bonus, like normal touch attacks.
So I like the secret arrow because it's just this really cool image of where you fire the arrow and then it just like stops in midair and then chases the person and goes around the obstacles and then it's such a Looney Tunes kind of idea.
It's the Patriot arrow from Robin Hood Men in Tights.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. It is
It
fantastic.
really is.
I actually think of it more as like the Yondu arrow in the MCU right now.
Yeah, that's a reasonable comparison
That's
too,
a
I guess.
pretty good comparison. So we've covered Seeker Arrow, we covered Phase Arrow, Hail of Arrows. This one feels kind of interesting. It's basically a ranged version of the Whirlwind attack feat, but your range is exponentially greater.
Yeah, what is it? A bazillion feet for a longbow?
A longbow's
100
default range is, I believe, 120 feet.
Yes.
10
Yes,
actually.
and in
So,
third edition, of course, you
that
can go
is
out
your-
to 10 times that distance.
Yes, so 1,200 feet is the maximum range of your hail. In mass combat, that is an incredibly deadly attack.
But it's
Every
limited
enemy-
to 10 or your level in Arcane Archer. So if you have not reached level 10, then it's even fewer people that you can hit.
Well, okay,
That's
sure.
very true.
Yes.
But still,
I'd
it's a
actually
lot of
like to add
targets.
that there's an enhancement in the DMG that increases your range. Add that in, and you're basically a sniper that kills everything in one round.
Well, 10 people, but
Yes. Well, often that could be the maximum number of enemies your DM wants to put on the board. More than that,
Yeah.
it gets ungainly.
most combats
That's
aren't going to
very
have
true.
that many more. And if they do, then that's where your imbue arrow fireball comes in, right?
Exactly.
Combine those two, and you have a very neat combo.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately,
And of
I'm
course,
pretty
then we
sure
have the
you
arrow of death.
All right. Arrow of Death.
Yeah, that's just our
One
one-shot
of
kill.
one of the very, very few times that martial characters get to mess with what spellcasters call save or die.
It's because
well-
Arcane Archer is a spellcaster.
Yes, I mean, like, I don't know. And plus, it's not even the only one in the Dungeon Master's Guide. We've got another one coming up, but we'll get to that.
I do feel that
So-
Arrow of Death is the other iconic feature of the Arcane Archer.
Most definite.
I mean,
Unfortunately, it's kind of undermined by the fact that slaying arrows also exist.
This is true. But
for me, the big
at least you
problem
don't
with
have to pay
Arcane
for it.
Archer, the big problem with Arcane Archer for me is that basically everything is once a day. I mean, imbue arrow you can do at will, but all the other ones, I've got one secret arrow, one phase arrow, and furthermore, they're all a standard action, so you can't even do them as part of a full attack.
Yes.
You're only making one attack, right?
And this is another thing that shows up, it shows its age, I should say, as one of the original Prestige classes, because as time passed and more classes were designed, you see that once per day less and less often. It still happens, but it's much less frequent.
Yeah, of course, the daily use limits are the main sort of paradigm of, well, D&D in general, really.
Yes.
That's very true, actually. But I would like to differ on one thing. Hail of Arrows, while it can be used only once per day, it can be imbue arrow or arrow of death. Since it's not standard action, it's just the regular attack action.
That's a good point.
Yep. All
I
right.
believe we should
I
transition
think
to
we're
Arcane
moving on
Trickster.
to the... Yes. Oh, Arcane Trickster. The
For
very
review,
first thing you are going to notice about this class, it has a D4 hit die.
Is that the first thing you're going to notice? That wasn't even close to the first thing that I noticed.
the thing I
That was
noticed is
like
the
maybe
name.
the 10th thing I noticed.
It was like not even calling to my attention when I reviewed the class.
Actually, the first thing I noticed was this pretty sweet picture of this guy that's like firing a laser beam with like both fingers together. Uh,
Yes.
that's pretty.
What you don't realize is he's using that laser beam just to open a chest across the room.
Well, no,
Yes.
that's like that makes like a little hand, right?
That's a mimic, not a chest.
So basically, an arcane trickster is how like the way that an arcane archer is supposed to combine archery with magic. Well, an arcane trickster is basically a straight up mashup of wizard and rogue. You need
Yes.
to be a third. You need to be able to cast third level arcane spells. You need to have the sneak attack ability of a 2d6 sneak attack dice. Um, and once you have that, then you can just take levels in this class, and it advances your sneak attack and it advances your spell casting.
Fun
But
thing about that 2d6 sneak attack requirement. Because it only requires 2d6, you don't actually have to be a rogue to take this class anymore.
Tomb
yeah,
of Battle.
Well,
Yes.
of course,
without that,
there are multiple
you
classes that give sneak attack, and this highlights one of the things that make prestige classes so unique to 3.5. Because in fourth edition you've got your paragon classes, in second edition you've got your kits, fifth edition you've got your subclasses. But what all those things have in common is that they all belong to a specific class. So, in fifth edition, if you want to be an arcane trickster, it's just a subclass of rogue, right? So only rogues can do it. But here in 3.5, Arcane Trickster is available to anyone who can cast third level arcane spells and use 2d6 sneak attacks. And that could actually represent a whole lot of different classes.
Indeed.
would actually like to add that it also has the requirement of that you cannot be lawful, and also you have quite a few skill requirements, which actually makes
Yes,
it more
this
incentivizing for rogue.
That's true. The
that
skills do
lawful
specifically come along with what rogues can do, yeah.
that non-lawful requirement is probably one of the things considered most problematic about third edition and sometimes prestige classes specifically.
I don't
Alignment.
know. I think that's another thing where it wouldn't even break my top 5 most problematic things about 3.5.
Well, for
I'd
me,
say
alignment
probably
is another one of those house rule away things where it's like, nope, I really don't care about alignment restrictions either.
We should do a
Alignment
mm,
podcast about
has
the flaws in 3.5.
alignment is not something that's ever bothered me, but that's because I don't see it as a flaw. I think the way people use it is often flawed, but not the system itself.
I don't think it's a flaw. I just think that this is another topic that we'll talk about later. Moving on.
Yes.
thing we
So,
should probably get turns to not interrupt each other.
yeah, so the actual first thing that I noticed about Arcane Trickster is that it has the same potential pitfall as Arcane Archer, where it has that pulling you in two directions thing, but then it totally avoids it because Arcane Trickster actually gives you full advancement for your spellcasting class. So you actually get to continue gaining new spells known, new spell levels, new spell slots as you're advancing in the class. In fact, you don't lose any progression at all. The only spellcasting progression you lose is whatever you needed to get the 2d6 sneak attack requirement, right?
And you also progress your sneak attack every other level just as a rogue would.
Exactly.
I would like
So
to
this,
add that since you only lose 3 caster levels due to the requirements of 2 die 6,
Yeah, if
level
you
20,
take rogue. Yep.
Yes. If you
forced.
if you get that sneak attack through a feat, you might not lose any.
The good thing about that is that by level 20, assuming you take the standard rogue entry, you can still get 9th level spells, assuming the 20th level limit many tables impose. Unfortunately,
sure,
if you're
sure.
a sorcerer, like you can't really do anything about it.
True.
And the Arcane Trickster is our first example of a paradigm that we'll see this become really common in prestige classes in a lot of other books, where when you have a spellcasting prestige class, that prestige class is just going to say, oh, well, at certain levels, you just get to level up your spellcasting as if you took a level of wizard or cleric or whatever class you were before.
Exactly. That's what makes prestige classes so great and prestigious is that you can kind of get into it from so many different ways, and then that leads to all that customization that I was hinting at earlier.
Now I believe it's time to get to the mechanics of it.
Yes.
Well, the mechanics are pretty simple. There's like 3 abilities that are unique to the class. We got
Not even
yes.
unique, really.
Yeah,
Well,
I guess there's
two are
really
unique.
2 that are unique to the
Yeah.
class.
Well, I'll start us
One
off.
can barely be considered an ability.
I will start us off then. Ranged legerdemain. Once per day, you may make a disable device, open lock, or sleight of hand check at a range of 30 feet. This allows your rogue to do their real sneaky stuff from a safe distance, often behind cover. Doing so, however, increases the difficulty of the skill check by 5, due to distance making precision movements a little bit more difficult. This
Right.
reason also means that you cannot take a 10 on that check.
So the basic use of this ability is you can use your Mage Hand spell to disarm traps from 40 feet away, or 30 feet away, so that you don't get caught in the blast radius if it explodes.
And I also add that this has a limit of 5 pound manipulation, so anything that's heavier than that is really just a useless fight.
Yeah, it's kind
Both
of annoying
characters.
and clunky, and it feels like they could have just said, oh, you can use Mage Hand to use these skills, and left it at that. But this is early 3.5, 3.0 even design technology, so I guess they didn't get that far.
At
So
least
I'll
this
cover the
one
next.
allows for multiple uses as you gain levels, though. There's that.
Yes.
More than
So
once per
I'll
day.
cover feature.
Yes. At level 9, you get to use this ability a grand total of 3 times per day.
Yes, and that's not as bad as it sounds, because typically you only have so many Mage Hands prepared anyway, so 3 per day is probably all your Mage Hands.
Although
So
you
the
don't
next
actually have to cast Mage Hand to use that.
Oh yeah, that's right, you
yeah,
don't.
that's actually pretty stupid, but I guess it's in the rules.
I didn't even notice that.
So
That's
moving
actually
to
the first thing that popped in
impromptu
my
sneak
mind.
attack.
Yeah, so this is
Basically,
kind of
impromptu sneak attack is like a way of setting up sneak attack.
yeah, it's kind of a really minor ability. It's like I think the idea is that you can use your little magical flibberty gibbets to distract the enemy for a second and get a sneak attack without having to meet the normal, the normal requirements for doing so.
However, that automatic sneak attack once or twice per day, sometimes that extra damage will be the difference between surviving or dying, especially against certain more, shall we say, specialized enemies.
I also add that this is also with its niche uses. Like, for example, thing about this is that against that specific attack that you declare, the target loses their dexterity to armor class. Even if they're immune to critical hits or sneak attack, any sneak attack damage, but they will still lose that bonus armor class. Hit.
That is a nice clarification. There's not too many times where that comes up, actually.
Yes.
Well, I can definitely think of some times. Like, imagine you're fighting against one of those little tiny, like bird constructs that shoots sparks at you. You got a bunch of those. You can make it lose its dexterity bonus.
I meant there
Yes.
aren't too many abilities that have that little exception.
Oh,
Yes.
sure.
Unfortunately, this is a limited use per day class and ability.
Yes.
So the key thing you need to
Overpowered.
remember with the key thing that you want to know about this class is it has a few once a day abilities, but the main feature that you really care about is that it's advancing your rogue features and your wizard features. So you're combining the 2 classes, and then you get a couple of extra once a day abilities as gravy, and they would end up following this model for a lot of their similar classes in the future.
Something that should also be mentioned is that the skill points of this class they're substantially lower than that of a rogue. While rogue gets 8 per level plus your intelligence, this one only gets 4 per level plus your intelligence.
Right.
Which
It's
is
kind of
a
like
nice middle ground between the wizard and the rogue.
right because the wizard
What
gets
they
2,
assume
the
you
rogue gets 8. But you figure you're probably more wizard than rogue, since you need 3rd level spells, but only 2d6 sneak attacks, so lean towards the wizard. It makes sense. There would eventually be several other, like rogue wizard combo prestige classes, building off of the arcane trickster, like the unseen seer. There's the what is it? The dagger spell mage.
Yes, and there's also the Master of the Unseen Hand.
I don't
But
even
also,
remember that one.
I don't think that one's
that's
too
actually based on
roguelike, though.
telekinesis. That's
Uh,
telekinesis, actually, not actually based on arcane trickster in any way.
the class itself is roguish, but it doesn't require a rogue to get into.
It's actually also
Actually,
that's precedent for other prestige classes, like, for example, the Spell Orb Sniper.
Oh, Spell Warp Sniper, that was the other one that I was
yeah,
trying to
that's
think
definitely a good one
Oh.
for rogues.
Yes, that's a fun one. All right, are we ready to move on?
I do think so. To Archmage.
of. Archmage.
Oh, how I hate this
Yes,
class.
we've already had a very large difference of opinions with Archmage.
Archmage is actually rather unique compared to its wizard counterpart. Though Archmage does advance casting just like a wizard does, and you lose no progression. However, it does have a variety of abilities. And
Yeah,
actually,
so
unlike most
Archmage
prestige
is
classes,
weird.
it does not grant them automatically. As in a way where you can choose which you get, but you have also to lose spell slots to get them.
Yeah, so this is sort of like a trade-off mechanic that we saw in Archmage and in another one, Hierophant, which is in the same book. And this is like, in order to get the abilities from the prestige class, you have to lose some of your spell slots. It's kind of interesting.
And that actually is something that shows up in other prestige classes as well later on as time passes. They kind of take that idea from the Archmage that you have to lose something to gain something. And I don't like that mechanic. I think that really detracts from a lot of choices that would otherwise be nice. But in the case of the Archmage, I actually think that it's completely justified.
Are there actually any other prestige classes that use this mechanic where you lose a spell slot to gain the benefit?
Offhand, I can't think of one that loses a spell slot, but I mean there are ones where you take penalties, like what's it, Alienist. You take hits to your stats to gain stuff. Green Star Adept. You take penalties to stats as you go up. So
There's also the more general spellcasting prestige class penalty where some levels won't progress your spellcasting at all,
that's true.
which
Yeah.
I feel might have been an extrapolation of the Archmage's High Arcana.
Yeah, I think this was
The
kind of
problem-
prototype of that
Pretty true.
ability.
The problem is, while some prestige classes will have abilities that completely compensate for losing 1 or 2 spellcaster levels, 99% of the High Arcana do not provide something that compensates for what you are giving up.
I definitely
That's very
disagree
true.
on that
I disagree
point.
as well.
Well,
I believe
the only way to solve this
actually-
is to go through them one at a time, I think.
Well, how about this? Let's rank each High Arcana out of good, bad, or not good. I don't know. There's a
Well,
bunch of
let's-
higher.
Let's start
Basically,
with
you advance your spell casting like Arcane Trickster does, right? You advance your casting at every level. But then at each level, you can pick a High Arcana, and that requires you to trade a spell slot to gain some cool benefit.
Yes. Permanently trade a spell slot. I think that's the key problem.
you
Let's
say
clarify
problem.
something
I say feature.
Let's clarify something. While you are trading slots of specific levels, you can prepare lower level spells on higher level spell slots. So even if you trade off all your 5th level spell slots, you can still prepare those spells in like 6th level or 7th level slots, for example.
Yes, but then why? Then you are preparing spells that could be used to prepare your 6th or higher level spells, which are often much more powerful than their lower level counterparts.
Well, that's
So
the
I don't-
opportunity cost
That's
that
true.
you take when you're taking Archmage, right?
Yeah, so why don't we go over the individual... we'll do a quick rundown, all the Arcanas, what they do, and then talk about them as a whole. How does that...
Right. Arcane Fire you are permanently sacrificing a 9th level spell slot in order to gain what is effectively a 3rd level spell effect at the cost of a 2nd spell slot that you must expend to activate it.
Yeah, that one is pretty bad.
Yeah,
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 it's
that's
probably the
probably
worst
the
thing.
worst.
Especially since it even costs more than Fireball and does less damage. So let's say you expend one 9th level slot, you deal 9 die 6 damage.
Yeah, we can throw Arcane Fire
Fireball is
straight
a
in.
3rd level and does 10 die 6.
Arcane Reach. This one is not bad in and of itself, were it not for the fact that the Reach spell meta magic exists.
To
So
be
this
fair,
one is
Reach didn't exist in the core book.
Yeah, so basically this means that if you have a touch range spell that requires you to like touch the person, instead of having to touch them, you can fire it like as a laser, and then you make a ranged attack, and if you hit them, then the spell goes off on them.
The big problem I have with most of the High Arcana, they can be replicated by metamagics that came later on, which are often more powerful or at the very least cheaper than the High Arcana is.
But see, I disagree, because with Arcane Reach, you don't have to use a higher spell slot when you're casting it at, range of 30 or 60 feet, instead of
No,
having
but
to apply the
instead,
Reach spell metamagic.
Yeah. Also, additionally, I think the prestige class level, this is actually the spell slot is less valuable than a feat.
Definitely.
Since you get more spell slots.
Yeah,
Higher
exactly.
ability score.
And you can change what your spell slots are every day. You can't change your feat every day.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I feel the higher the level of the spell slot, the greater its relative value. And
Very
Arcane Reach takes away a 7th level spell slot.
So let me put it this way:
Those are often just as, if not more powerful than feats.
so which is a better feat? Would you rather take the extra slot feat to get an extra 7th level slot, or would you rather take the reach spell meta magic feat?
Honestly, I would rather take the Reach spell meta magic.
So you're admitting that the reach spell meta magic is better than a 7th level spell slot.
You
He's
wouldn't
got you
need
there.
that you would not need the extra spell slot feat if you didn't take Arcane Reach.
Yeah, I would argue otherwise. I would take the extra slot. You think about it this way. Reach spell is a plus to meta magic. Meanwhile, Arcane Reach does not really change it in any way for spell level. And Arcane Reach has a limit of 60 feet. Meanwhile, Reach spell has a limit of 30.
Arcane Reach
Better
only
anyway.
has that 60-foot limit if you take it twice.
Yeah,
So
it's
you
actually
have
35.
permanently sacrificed 2 of your 7th level spell slots.
So the real reason I don't like Arcane Reach is because wizards already have a familiar and they can deliver touch spells through it. So if you want to do touch spells at a distance, you got it right there. That's how you do it.
All right, then.
Is that familiars, when they die, you lose experience. So not many people really want to do that.
I thought it was Constitution loss, not experience.
No, it's experience. Right? Yeah.
I believe it is experience, yeah.
I could have been looking at something else.
Losing your familiar totally messes you up. But
Yeah.
Anyways, the next High Arcana. This is the one I actually like the most. I think it is the most balanced out in terms of cost and benefit. You permanently sacrifice a 7th level spell slot to apply the spell turning spell, which is also a 7th level spell. So you are applying spell turning to any and all counterspell attempts that you make from then on. You have given up a 7th level ability, and you are gaining an exponential use of a 7th level ability from that point forward. This is where I see a more balanced exchange rate.
I'd like to say that I don't really like this ability because there's a couple things. First of all, spell turning does it passively. Counterspelling takes a ready action. And third of all, there's a spell, albeit 9th level, called Swinchi's Spell Shift, where you can do exactly the same without losing a spell slot. Sometimes, and you have even other options to choose from that.
Counterspelling sucks unless you specialize for it. That's a problem with counterspelling, not necessarily with the High Arcana itself. The
Interestingly
High
enough,
Arcana makes counterspelling somewhat more worth it, especially if you are going to specialize.
and the prerequisites of Archmage sort of naturally predispose you towards counterspelling because you're supposed to know a bunch of spells from different schools. And assuming you take the improved counterspell feat, which you probably will if you're counterspelling a lot, then you'll need to have a spell of that school prepared. You don't need to have the exact spell. So, they kind of line up nicely.
That's very true.
Yes.
In fact, they reflected this in Unearthed Arcana when they gave a test-based prerequisite to this class. You could get into the Archmage class by passing a test where an opposing mage is going to cast a bunch of spells, and you have to counter all of them using your improved counterspell feat or something. It kind of makes you wonder why improved counterspell wasn't a prerequisite for the class.
I believe we should go to Master of Elements now.
Actually, before we move on, that's a great idea, but before we move on, it's worth mentioning that the prerequisites are already pretty steep, and that might be part of why they didn't have improved counterspelling tacked on, because they've already got 3 feats required, 2 level 15 skills, and the ability to cast 7th level spells.
Yes,
Archmage is a high-level class.
Yeah.
It is worth noting that you will not get into Archmage before level 13. Just period.
Yeah.
This is one of the ones that's meant to be like super elite. Like only the most powerful characters will be able to be an Archmage. It's also kind of why they made the class like anything that you can get at 5th level from the class, you can also get at 1st level. So you can take 1 level of Archmage, get the ability you want. So you could have,
Yes, for example, a counterspell specialist might only take 1 level in order to get mastery of counterspelling.
Right, or an evoker might take only 1 level to get the mastery of elements.
Which is what we'll talk about right now.
Yeah.
Mastery of Elements basically allows you to change the damage type from an energy type to another of a spell you cast.
Yes, you can turn.
However, this is only for like effect or area spells.
The
Could not be affected. This actually
the big
substituted later
reason
on by the energy substitution metamagic.
Yes.
Is basically free.
Yes, the energy substitution metamagic is the big reason I don't like mastery of shaping. Or, I'm sorry, mastery of
Elements.
energy. Elements. My eyes are jumping all over my notes. I am sorry.
That's fine. But
And
what's
then it
good
costs
about
a big
Mastery of
drop.
Elements is that you can change it on the fly, so if you're going up against opponents that have different elemental weaknesses within, a short span of time, you don't have to have prepared for one in particular.
Right, it's like turbocharging the elemental substitution feat, which actually, incidentally, did exist at the time the Dungeon Master's Guide for 3.5 was published. It was in one of the 3.0 books.
Tone and Blood, if I'm not mistaken. The problem with that is that you lose an 8th level slot, and even then, Archmage already has 3 prerequisite feats.
Right.
You can take energy substitution for all of it and not lose a spell slot.
Mm-hmm.
And it is worth mentioning that this really only impacts blasting, and, blasting is somewhat suboptimal, I'll say.
Hey, blasting is great, but we'll talk about that in a future podcast.
Yes, let's please not get into that now.
Mastery of shaping?
Carry on?
Indeed.
Yeah. Mastery of shaping lets you basically leave holes in your area spells so that you can make your allies immune to it. It's pretty cool, although it does cost a 6th level spell slot. That's one of the cheaper abilities in this class. Actually, it's one of my favorite ones.
Yeah,
personally.
I like this one. And yes, there's also the sculpt spell, metamagic.
Yeah, there's metamagics.
Again.
Yep.
But I still like it. I think Mastery of Shaping is a great one.
And in this one, I think Archmage did do it first.
Yes.
However, what I would like to say that's not as good, or, well, occasionally not as useful from this one, it makes a hole in there, so any enemies could just Radiant Action to get in your space and, well, not be affected.
Well, see, that's not really a big deal, because if they're ready in action to move, they can just ready in action to move out of the area, entirely.
You can't ready in action to move.
Sure you can. You can ready move action.
I'm pretty sure you can only ready your standard action.
But you can do a move as a standard action. Yeah.
Right, that is true. I think we've addressed everything there is about Mastery of Shaping.
Yeah. So then we got Spell Power, which is the boring one.
Spell power is what I consider the hands down worst of the high arcana.
Yeah.
Basically,
It's the
you
best one
you
in my
lose a
opinion.
5th level spell slot, and it gives you +1 caster level.
Yeah.
Whee.
I'm sorry, there are so many ways to get +1 caster level that this is actively punishing yourself for playing an archmage.
It makes your spells like just that little tiny bit more powerful, but the thing is, a lot of the spells that care about caster level also have a cap of how much they care about caster level. So if you're level a 15th level wizard and you're taking this, a lot of your spells, they cap out at caster level 15. You don't get a benefit from going from 15 to 16.
Mm-hmm.
But then we have spell-like ability, which is arguably the best high arcana, and it only costs a 5th level spell slot.
This one is crazy.
I
Yeah.
call it the second worst because
Wow.
Okay.
you are permanently burning 2 spell slots. One to take the high arcana itself, and then a second one to select your spell.
Yes, but
You
you get
have
to cast
permanently
that spell
sacrificed
twice as a spell-like ability, which is
Arcane
great.
Thesis.
You
Arcane
give up 2
Thesis.
spell slots, but you also gain 2 spell slots
Yeah.
effectively because you can use a spell-like ability twice a day.
Right, and
So
the
this one
two that you
actually
gain
has-
are most likely going to be higher than the one that you lost, i.e. the 5th level one.
Yeah, so this actually is a pretty sweet ability.
Personally, I still think this one, there are feats that do it better.
That's true. I would say innate spell does it better. Unfortunately, it's +8 levels, so it's not very useful.
But see, the thing here is you don't have to prepare it anymore. So it's kind of like you take something that you know you're going to cast, you know you're going to cast it a lot, and then you've got it and you're gold. You don't have to worry so much about it anymore. And again, it's not like it's just a spell that you cast. Now it's a spell-like ability, which has a different... Should we go over spell-like abilities now?
Spell-like
No.
abilities versus
No.
spells, a whole different thing. Spell-like abilities
Yes,
like
that
DCs,
is
you
an
don't have
episode
components.
of itself.
Maybe
And
like half an episode where we talk about different ability types.
Well, do we want
So
to say
let's do-
more about Archmage?
Yeah, so my summary of the
We
Archmage
covered
class would be that it's actually a really interesting mechanic, in my opinion. The trade-off of you're not just taking these levels, but you're also giving up specific spell slots in order to gain the benefit. And eventually this morphed into, you only level up your spellcasting at certain levels, right? In certain levels you just get no spellcasting at all. But I think I like the Archmage model a lot better, where you lose just a single spell slot instead of all your progression. It's a lot softer, and they didn't end up using it in the future, and I kind of wonder why.
What I like about the Archmage is that it's like more customizable in a way than all the Prestige classes, except for Hierophant, where you can really just like trade stuff for stuff you want. You don't have to get the stuff you don't want.
Yeah,
And we will get to Hierophant.
I mean,
Right.
Hierophant, basically, it's literally the same class, except for Divine Casters.
Almost. Almost.
It does have different options though.
Also, not almost as totally the same.
No, they don't advance spellcasting.
Well,
It's
okay,
true,
but
they
let's
only
be
have
real, it's the
caster
same.
level.
Yeah, it pretty much is the same.
It's copy pasted really.
All right. So shall we sign off, everyone?
All right.
Yeah,
Once again, this is FantasyPen.
this is Troacctid.
That's you, Flap.
People.
Then,
And Mike
Right,
saying
Yes.
so long and farewell.